So, like I said in my email a while ago, one of the reasons I want to do these meetings is because we're gonna experience some changes in live production in the coming months, like this year for sure. That includes new cameras, new camera types, and the production's gonna kind of blow up a little bit. It's gonna be a little bit bigger. So it's important that everyone really understands how to use all the cameras we have and understands all the settings and why these settings matter to begin with. So some of these will be focusing on the cameras themselves and your equipment. Some of them will be on composition, but then I also kind of want to go even further than that and go into like art concepts, and we'll do some musical exercises, some directing exercises, and maybe even lighting and exposure, because with some of the cameras you'll be using, even you're going to need to know and understand exposure properly. So we're going to touch on everything. And if there's anything you want to learn about that I might not think of immediately, feel free to suggest it, and we can definitely take a meeting to do it. Even if you don't think it's live production or related to live production, we can still touch on it. Pretty much the only thing we're not going to touch on here is post-production video editing, because that would require software and it wouldn't translate one-to-one. But camera techniques, certain film techniques, specific cuts, transitions, timing, just anything you can think of, feel free to suggest it and we can take a session to do it. Today we're going to be talking about camera lenses, specifically the ones that are at FC. And so I brought this one here. This is technically an older lens, the ones that we used for our Sony cameras back before we transitioned to the ones we have now. Luke, Leah, Evan, you guys worked with this lens at Awake in the Dawn. They're pretty much identical in like every aspect, but they don't work with our latest cameras because they don't cover the sensor fully, so you'd see a black shadow around the image. So these are outdated, but they're pretty much in every other way identical to the lenses we have at Forerunner Church. This is ENG lens. ENG stands for Electronic News Gathering. So this is the type of lens you would see on a news production with someone having a shoulder rig and they're just walking around. So it's suited for that kind of production where you're walking around and you're able to keep your focus, zoom in and out like as close and wide as possible, but still maintaining a sharp focus wherever you're going. So that's what this type of lens is for. You got 3 different rings on the lens. The one closest to the camera is your iris, and it'll go from the lowest number, 1.4, that's the brightest, to all the way to C, which is closed. So absolutely no light enters the camera. So normally when we're working, this is controlled by the engineer, and so they'll automatically adjust that for you. But if you're doing handheld, you're going to be moving and adjusting that yourself. There will be no control from the trailer. So to do that, there's a switch here on the zoom control. It set to M right now, and that lets me move it and adjust it. If it was set to A, automatic, then the engineer would be able to control it. So sometimes if we don't have an engineer at FC, we'll even tell you to switch it to manual so that you can control it and we still have aperture control throughout the set. The second ring here, this is your zoom ring. So it'll zoom in and zoom out. The markings here indicate how wide it'll go and how tight in it'll go. So this one goes from 6.4 all the way to 128. So real wide, real tight in. And then the last one is your focus ring. And this is to adjust your focus. So we're gonna go over each one of these kind of step by step. My goal with this is to kind of help you understand why sometimes it might be easier to get focus on a shot and sometimes it's harder, and why sometimes it might look weird from a specific angle, or sometimes it looks normal if like you're zoomed in, or maybe you're not zoomed in, you're boomed in or something like that. So let's actually start with zooming on this lens, okay? So whenever you're zooming, you're changing the millimeter count on the lens, right? And these millimeters refer to basically where light intersects inside of the camera lens and the distance from that intersection to the camera sensor. So basically, imagine light just hits the front of the lens, bounces all around, converges somewhere around here, and the actual sensor is here. So that's the millimeter number is that distance. The closer it is to the sensor, the wider your depth of field and your field of view is. So essentially, you might notice when you're zoomed out on a wide on any of your cameras, you can basically see everything in focus. And that's because you have a small millimeter number. So you can see the whole room in focus, but you can also pretty much see what's on stage in focus. The more you increase that number, the bigger that distance becomes, and the shallower your focus field becomes, and also the tighter your field of view becomes. So 128 on this would get you a close-up on stage, but then all of a sudden your focus field becomes super shallow. So you're no longer working with all that space you had before, where it's like you didn't even really have to touch the focus wheel. Now everything's where everything was in focus. Now, like just one specific thing might be in focus. And that happens whenever you increase that number. That depth of field expands or shrinks. Does everyone understand that so far? Okay, cool. So the other thing that affects that is your aperture. So if you're in a dark spot and we have to crank up the aperture to bring more light in, that ends up shrinking your field of depth even more. So it might be easier for you to get something in focus on stage where everyone has bright lights on them and we're at an aperture of 5.6 or 4, where in the pit it's like 1.4, and even then it's still not properly exposed, so you're going to have a really hard time getting your focus. And then you're zoomed in to a close-up probably, so it'll even be even more difficult. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then the last thing is your focus ring. So if you look at this, and I'll pass this lens around so you can all take a look at it. You notice there's markings on this lens. You know, there's a 3 here, 4.5, 6, 8, 12, 20, 50, and then the infinity symbol, right? So this is indicating the distance that you're focusing from the lens, how far your subject is away. So I can literally take a measurement from where I'm standing to wherever someone is and be like, okay, it's between me and Evan, it's like 10 feet, maybe a little less. And so I can find that right on the lens and it'll be right in focus, right, just by using that number. But something you might notice is the higher up the number you get, the more distance there is between these numbers. So from like 3 feet and 4.5 feet, like there's a lot of distance to travel there to get your focus. But from 4 feet to 6 feet, it gets even shorter. 6 to 8, again, 8 to 12. And then you have very little room to work all the way up to infinity, where like at infinity, it's like, that's the end of its distance. And so like everything from there and beyond is in focus. Is that making sense so far? So what I'm trying to say with this is that once you're getting further and further away from the camera, you have to make very small adjustments to your focus to get something in focus. Rather, where if something's close to the camera, you have a lot of wiggle room to work around to get your focus. At Forerunner Church, the camera's pretty far away from the stage. So you're kind of working with just this like small range over here where you don't really have to move it a ton to get your focus. So you have to be really careful with your adjustments where you're not moving a lot. Sometimes you really just want to move just a teensy bit, like just to really get the focus as sharp as it can be. Everyone on the same page on that? Okay.
So like if cam 1 was like in the middle of the front row seats, like maybe it would be, we would have to do a lot more turning to get that focus than it is right now where you just have to go like a hair. Yeah.
The closer it is, the shallower your depth of field kind of becomes. You have much more to work with, and then the further something is, the wider it becomes. And that has to do with the way light travels. So when it's all perspective, essentially, right? So when light hits a sensor, or when it hits a lens, it's actually kind of hitting it in like a cone shape, essentially, where it converges onto a single point, right? And because of that, the information that you get when it's closer to camera, there's kind of more detail the closer you get, because you can see actual separation from something further away. But the further and further you get, and you can experience this yourself if you ever look at like the horizon, things kind of start to like blend in together and mush up. Like you can see like cities and buildings and mountains, and they kind of, just after a certain point, it just kind of looks like one flat thing. You can't see like the distance between each one of them.
It is.
And so that just has to do because of the way light travels and specifically hits your eyes, and in this case, the lens and the sensor. Yeah.
What was this first one again? That's the exposure?
Yeah, that's the iris. So the iris is measured in f-stops. And so you'll notice it goes from 1.4 to 2 to 2.4 to 4 to 4.8 to 5.6. Each one of those is a stop, and every stop is a doubling in light. So just from one number to another, you have twice the amount of light from the last one.
Is it actually 1.4, 2.8? I also see the 2 in between.
Yeah.
Is it double from 1.4 to 2.8?
No, it doubles from 1.4 to 2. Yeah.
Okay.
It doubles from 1.4 to 2. And easy way to remember these f-stops is that every other is literally twice the number from two before. So 1.4 and would be 2 above would be 2.8.
Right.
And then above that is 5.6. And then so it's a little bit of getting used to in your head, but I know that in between, after 1.4 it's 2.
Right.
And I know twice of 1.4 is 2.8, twice of 2 is 4,
Right.
twice of 2.8 is 5.6.
Right.
So, it just kind of makes sense there.
Uh-huh.
So you're not really going to be using that information too much while you're cam opping, but it's a good idea to know like what f-stop you're at and how much light you're increasing, essentially.
Uh-huh.
Now at the trailer, we don't really call it aperture, we just call it iris. Those two terms are interchangeable.
Okay.
So if you ever hear me or Jonathan or anyone just say iris instead of aperture or vice versa, we're talking about the same thing. Just,
And iris up, more light.
Yeah.
Everything goes up, including the number. Right?
Yeah, the smaller the number, the brighter the image. just so you know.
Okay.
That's where it gets confusing. Yeah.
So irising down lets more light in.
No, irising down. We literally use down and up to refer to
I see.
darkness and brightness. So down would be dark,
Okay.
up would be bright.
Okay.
But it gets, if you start thinking about the numbers, it gets a little confusing.
It's inverted on the numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we're irising down to make it darker,
Yeah.
we're actually going from 1.4 to 2.
Yes, to iris it down.
And if we're irising up, the vice versa.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so
To make
if I have you guys do manual aperture control, I will tell you iris up, and so you will have to go to a lower number.
Okay.
Now, when you're cam opping, you won't really have the time to look at the numbers.
Right.
You'll just have to understand up
Which
is
direction?
brighter. Yeah.
Yeah. Up is brighter,
So-
but we're gonna be, if we were looking at it, we'd be taking it down in numbers.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, and if you're ever in engineering, you will see the numbers. So to my engineer, I will specifically say, hey, this is too bright, bring it down by half a stop, because you can even do half stops. Those markings aren't on there. Those will tell you full stops, but you can put the ring in between two of the stops and get half stops.
Is that what F stands for, is full?
F does not stand for that. I forget what F stands for, but it's actually an equation. You replace the F with the millimeter number of your lens, and then you put in the maximum aperture. It would be 1.4 in this one. And dividing that gives you the actual optical diameter of your lens. So you can, like, a really high number divided by 1.4 would, make a pretty big lens, essentially, because you need a big lens to match the aperture size.
So this, what?
That one is 128 by 120, or sorry, 1.4. So it would be, I can't do the math in my head right now.
So it would
But
be 128 divided by 1.4.
yeah.
Would give you the optical diameter. I
Yeah.
don't even know. Well, that's just the diameter of the sensor.
Yeah, it would literally be the size of the lens, essentially.
Oh, the lens, not the sensor.
Yeah, not the sensor.
Okay.
The sensor's on the camera itself.
Right.
Yeah. So,
And this white line here is where it's like actually at.
yeah, the white line is where you line it up with the number,
Okay.
essentially. I'll tell you. So, yeah, you won't really ever be using that calculation. That's literally just a kind of idea to get how big a lens is going to be. But have you ever seen like the behind the scenes of a TV broadcast station, and they have these really big box lenses,
Yeah.
whatnot?
Probably.
Those lenses, they can go up to 900 millimeters. And the f-stop on those, the bigger the millimeter number, the less light you usually get. So I saw one at 900 millimeters was an aperture of 4. So that was like an optical diameter of 220 something. So that's what makes them so big. Plus they have a bunch of motherboards and other computer equipment on the actual lens mechanism itself. That gives them that size.
Its maximum aperture, it would be 4, which is a couple
Yeah.
of steps up already
Yeah.
on this one,
Yeah.
or a couple steps down.
And each stop is a doubling of light, or so.
That's quite a.
So from 4 to 1.4, or was it one? Yeah, from 4 to 1.4, you're losing quite a bit of light.
Yeah, like 3 doublings.
Yeah, so exponentially, essentially.
Yeah.
Let's see, 2.8. Yeah, at least 2 to 3 stops.
Wow.
So 1.4 is really good. You can get even smaller, like a smaller number but wider aperture. And that would let in more light. But like I said, that brings in complications where your focus field gets really narrow. So typically you won't really ever see us use that 1.4 aperture on most of our shoots. You'll see us stay around 4, because that's where like the sweet spot is on a lot of these lenses. Another tip that you can use when you're handhelding or using these lenses, your aperture not only determines your focus field, but how sharp your focus is going to be as well. So the sharpest point in any lens is 2 to 3 stops above its maximum aperture. So for this lens, its sharpest focus is around 4 to 5. For a lens that has an aperture of 4, maximum aperture of 4, its sharpest would be around 8. So if you're ever handhelding these and you just want to get the sharpest focus, you're gonna be somewhere around 4, like 4 or 5.6, somewhere around there. Now, obviously, we want a well-exposed image, so if you need to go brighter, go brighter. But that's might be somewhere where you want to hang around if you're doing that. Yeah. Any other questions on aperture so far?
Well, it's not quite on aperture, and it's actually not on that lens as far as I can, or on that lens as far as I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always wondered about the difference between aperture and ISO, which.
Yeah,
Do you
good
find
question.
that on these kinds of lenses, or is that just?
So ISO is on the camera itself because that affects the sensitivity of the light sensitivity of the sensor, essentially. What's literally happening is, so the way a sensor works, you have this chip made of silicone, and it has a bunch of different pixels on it, and each pixel has a capacitor attached to it. And when light hits the sensor, it's actually like creating what do they call it? Neutrons. And that reading is then processed by the computer or the motherboard on the camera, and it's like, okay, that's how bright that area that's being hit by the sensor is right now by using a electrical measurement, essentially. So when you're increasing the ISO on a camera, you're basically supercharging that information with the capacitors attached to those pixels. You're like, I need more light, so add some more voltage into it, essentially.
Yeah.
And so it ups it and you get a brighter image. Now, when you do that, you're creating more noise because you're introducing more electricity into the image, essentially.
Oh, so that's where that comes.
Yeah.
Is electricity.
Yeah.
Just
So,
like a lot of this crosses over into sound kind of stuff.
yeah.
So interesting.
It works in very similar. Speaking of which, another way. So ISO is it's the common way most consumers refer to it, but when you get really deep into it in film, we start referring to it in decibels even.
Really?
Yeah. So and every 3 decibels is a doubling in light.
Is that so? Is gain when someone's talking about gain, is it referring to that?
Yes.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
It's the exact same.
Yep, it's the exact same.
Wow.
So the deeper you get into it, it's really fascinating. Just like how because even some of the stuff didn't originate with like video work. It's like really old radio frequency type of lingo. In the trailer, have all of you gotten a chance to be in engineering? Yeah, I think you're the only one, Luke, who hasn't been there once. So when you're exposing, you have a waveform that tells you the exposure on each camera, right? So you can literally see what's the brightest point, what's the darkest point, and where everything in the middle lives. That is measured in 2 ways: millivolts, which is what it was set to. I recently changed it to IRE because IRE is measured in percentages, and we're gonna be doing a lot of different calibrations recently, so we need that. But IRE stands for Institution of Radio Engineers. So, yeah. So it's something like,
Which is not visual
yeah,
at
it
all.
doesn't have anything to do with like video, but it's the acronym that is used to read a waveform for video work. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah. So ISO also has an acronym that doesn't have anything to do with cameras. I forget what it is, but it's like it has almost nothing to do with like the actual function essentially.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so these ISO is sort of the only thing that's on the
Yeah.
camera itself.
So there's two things on the camera that affect exposure. So you mentioned one of them, ISO, and the other one is your shutter speed.
Right.
So for video work, you typically don't touch those two. So I'll explain why, and we'll start with ISO, right? ISO, there's this thing with ISO known as your native ISO, or your base ISO. And that refers to the minimum / natural sensitivity of your image sensor. And for a lot of cameras, that's around the 800, 640 mark. Some cameras have it up at 3200, so they have a much higher light sensitivity with little noise. But a lot of cameras tend to stick around like that 800 area. On these cameras, they'll kind of default to that base ISO. On consumer cameras, you can go even below that. Like my Sony A7, the base ISO for that on video is 800, but it lets you go down to like an ISO of 100, so really dark, which is useful for if you're shooting in a sunny area. The thing is, it will negatively affect your image still in the end.
The other way.
Yeah, going any direction from your base ISO will affect your image. It'll incorporate more noise, essentially.
Really? So there's
Yeah.
noise with the darker as well, not
Yeah.
just lighter.
Well, what ends up happening is essentially it's doing some computing and it's like artificially darkening some spots, essentially.
Right.
So, like modern cameras, they're really good at reducing or cleaning up the noise. So you might not even see it, but it's done in the post, and you might see some artifacts, but it's gotten really good. I'll say that much.
Isn't noise used like tastefully and
So film has grain in it, right? And film has natural grain because when film was made, if you look at the individual cells in a film, they're all differently shaped crystals from one frame to the other, and so when you play them quickly back to back, the grain in film kind of looks like it's moving. It's very organic because they're all differently shaped. So people like it in older stuff because of that. It has a kind of like lifelike feeling and it's sometimes even equated to cinematic feel. ISO, not quite, because they're all pixels. Now it's easy to kind of like just if you see the grain on digital camera to just be like, oh, it's essentially the same thing, and you can use it creatively like that, but it depends on the vision you want essentially at the end.
so usually they would have grain in post more than
Yes, I 100%. You always want to shoot with the best settings, and then in post, just add whatever look you're going for. There may be some exceptions where, like, you just kind of want to have it done, like, from the first shoot or whatever, or maybe like when you're exposing something and it's too bright, you might want to cut some of that light out before it even gets to post, so that you're not like dealing with crushed images. So you'll put a filter on your lens. But there aren't too many scenarios where I see it being more advantageous to do it beforehand rather than in post. Unless you're trying to get like an optical flare type of thing, or maybe introduce some haze that affects the light in a certain way. Like if you're going for something that has to do with light, essentially, it might be better to do during the shoot than in post. But something like that, probably better in post. Yeah. The second thing that I mentioned earlier, shutter speed, right? So shutter speed literally just means how long the sensor is being exposed to light for per frame, essentially. So the way it was done before was literally you had a spinning disc with a slit cut into it, and that was measured in degrees, and then that would spin, and that would expose parts of the frame over like the span of less than a second. So for a lot of film, that was 180 degrees. So literally just be like half a disc, and it'd be spinning around and exposing like parts of the frame as it's spinning around. So in film, you might hear the shutter speed be referred to in degrees. Nowadays, it's referred to in milliseconds, or not, in fractions of a second. So you could hear 1/48th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/20th of a second, and that literally just means how often your sensor is on or off, essentially. So when you power on your camera, your sensor is turning on and off quickly, consecutively, to like basically let light in. The slower it is, which would be like let's say 1/20th of a second, it's pretty slow. So the slower it is, the more light it captures, and the faster it is, the less light. Now, when you're making it slower, things get a little tricky, because then you start introducing motion blur, because light has more time to kind of like smear around, like any movement, essentially. It's not just quick and clean. So for sports stuff, you'll usually see stuff with a higher shutter speed count, because you want to see, like, let's just say you're playing soccer and someone kicks the ball. You want to see perfectly like that ball going from one end to the other. So they'll usually have it at a higher shutter speed, so you can clearly see where it is rather than just a smear across the screen. But for video and film, we kind of stick to what's called the 180 degree rule, where you essentially kind of have your shutter speed be twice the speed of your frame rate. So at Forerunner Church, we shoot at essentially 30 frames a second. It's technically 60 frames, but it's interlaced, so it's half of that. So we shoot at 30 frames a second, so our shutter speed has to be at 1/60th of a second. And then we don't touch it. And the reason we do that is because that produces the most accurate, or close to at least, natural human motion blur, what your eyes essentially see. So unless we're trying to do something creative, and that would be like something in post-production, we always set our shutter speed to be twice our frame rate. So we have it at like 1/60th of a second. I think maybe some of them are at 1/100th. I think the Cam 4 is set to 1/100th, and you might notice that when you're like looking at the drum shots, the sticks look like maybe a little crisper. There's not like as much motion blur when you're moving it, and that's just a limitation of the camera. They technically weren't made for broadcast; they were made for medical use.
Really?
Yeah, the Sony ones, the one that's like on Cam 4 and whatnot.
Yeah.
The other ones we have are actual broadcast
Made for
cameras.
medical use?
Sorry,
You
what?
said medical use?
Yeah, medical use. So you would just like, you know how there's surgery classes essentially, or I don't want to say surgery classes, actual surgeries where they have people come in and
Oh, they
watch
use
and
the
mentor.
camera.
Yeah, so they mount cameras and they're all robotic essentially. But they mount the cameras because you can't have a ton of people be around a surgeon at a critical point. So instead, they put everyone else in a separate room, and then you just have a bunch of those cameras with those lenses zooming in to actually see like the actual operation.
Okay.
So
Thought so. I was just kind of like,
How come that one won't go at 1/60th, but it can go at 100, and why?
it's just in the settings. I don't know
It
why. When
it literally can't, but it
Yeah.
can't go to 1/60th. It can only go to.
yeah, it's either there's two options. It's either fully open or 1/100th,
Oh, okay.
and so
Okay.
we just have it
Okay,
at
I see
1/100th.
now.
Yeah.
Because there's only two options.
Yeah. So we just leave it at that. It's Cam 4 and those cameras, we really shouldn't be using them anymore. And hopefully we won't be. But
Those
But,
cameras meeting all the other ones?
the old ones, the ones,
One,
the,
like 1 and 2?
no, 1 and 2, those are good. Camera 4 specifically.
Just 4?
Yeah.
Maybe other ones in store.
So
that same type.
Camera 1 through 3, those are, when I refer to them, those are Panasonic cameras. So I'll just keep referring to them as Panasonics. Camera 4 is a Sony camera. So, and that one's much older than these other ones. So the Sony cameras specifically, kind of want them gone. But it's for another time. Okay, so any other questions on the lens, the exposure settings, or anything with that? No? Okay. So I'm going to try to wrap this up because we have to be out of here in like 10 minutes. But one of the reasons I want you guys to understand this is so that when you're actually on your cameras, you kind of understand the importance of getting your focus, and maybe by you understanding some of these things, you know the limitations of your lens as well. So let's say if you're getting a Singer shot on camera 2, the 3 Singer mids, if you want to have them all in focus, you might not necessarily want to be zoomed in all the way because then your focus field gets really narrow. So you know that you have to be zoomed out a specific distance to get them all in focus. And or if you're getting let's say on the jib, the Singer's head to toe, right? That's pretty close to the end of your zoom distance on the Singers, and because of that, that also makes your focus field pretty shallow. And not only that, where they're standing is pretty close to infinity on your lens as well. So it makes it even harder to get that shallow focus. So it's really important to know, okay, to get that focus, I just need to make the tiniest of movements on the wheel, to get that to translate accurately to the lens. There's another trick with focus that I want to touch on, and a quirk with this lens that will be useful. And you can start doing this almost immediately. So when you're getting your focus, it's never, here, I'll draw it out on this board. it doesn't work equally like across all subjects. Like let's say you have your 3 singers here. Right. Let's draw these 3. So let's say you want to get a shot of all 3 of them in focus. So you might instinctively think, okay, well, I'm going to get in focus singer 2, and that should get everyone in focus, right? Well, that's actually not how your focus works. The way that you want to focus is kind of actually in between singer 1 and 2. And the reason for that is because your focus actually kind of works like this, where wherever you focus, you have just a little bit in front in focus, and then quite a bit more in the back in focus. So if I were to focus on this person, singer 1 would be out of focus, or I guess singer 3 at this point. Singer 3 would be out of focus, but singer 1 would be in focus. So you kind of always, if you're working with multiple subjects, you want to aim towards the one closest to the camera, or in between like the closest person and the person behind them. And then that'll make sure that you get that 3rd person in focus as well.
Is that on cam 3 and the GPR, like cam 4?
Every camera will do this.
Okay, yeah, because cam 2 would...
Oh, but yeah, but the angle, I guess you're saying. Yeah, camera 1 and camera 2, at FC, camera 4 here, it could also do it because they're at a slight angle, but you'd notice more was camera 2 here. Was camera 5 here, that's not as much of a deal because they're all kind of just like, yeah, perpendicular and you're looking at them straight on. But if you have anything at an angle where they're literally further from the other, yeah.
Then you get the one that's closer, in between the one that's closer and second closest.
Yeah.
To get, and then that should give us 3
yeah.
instead of doing 2, which would make it blur. Okay.
Yeah, and then you zoom out, and that expands your focus, your field of depth, or depth of field, sorry, and that'll get all of them in focus.
That's cool.
So
I think I would typically get singer 1 in focus.
yeah,
Singer 1's important.
yeah. So, but that makes singer 3 out of focus essentially. Right. So yeah, you want to kind of aim closer to the camera so you get singer 3 in focus essentially.
Yeah, I've been noticing that on camera too.
Yeah. So.
I'm gonna be quick and I'll be like, the rest are out of focus, but this guy's in focus.
Yeah. So that's something that you can do pretty much immediately when you're trying to get focused. Just kind of remember that it's like, okay, let's start with what's closest, and then kind of maybe throw the focus just a little bit further back. Remember, you don't have to move it all that much to like change your focus distance, and then you'll get all 3 of them in focus. Now, again, if you're at the end of your zoom lens, like that's still going to be very shallow. But if you're doing a mid shot of several people, it should like increase it enough to get them all in focus. And then another quirk was these lenses. You might have noticed. Let me erase this. That sometimes you get your focus on a subject and then you reframe and all of a sudden it's out of focus. And I just want to tell you, you're not crazy. That is happening. But what's going on is that these lenses, because of, and this is because they're zoom lenses specifically, there's some distortion that happens occasionally with light traveling through the lens. And that happens to be right around the edges. So like around here and here. So most of the time you have your subject composed within this circle and they're in focus. But let's say during speaking or even a singer shot where you have multiple people, you'll have one person here and then another person like here. And so you'll notice that they start to look kind of blurry and out of focus. And that, frankly, just doesn't look very good, especially if you're sticking on it very long. With a singer pan, you can get away with it because the focus will literally move across the singers. But when you're like, let's say during announcements and you have 2 people, they're both out of focus the whole time because you'll have them literally at the extreme edges. So the way around this, so when you're getting your focus, frame it up exactly as you're gonna like have it taken live, and get your focus there so that these edges look in focus, and basically everything will be in focus. Does that make sense?
So focus from a mid.
Not from a mid. You can do from a close up, but have them at the edges essentially.
I see. So you zoom in on one of them instead of centering
Yeah.
Isaac and getting your focus. You put him on the left.
Yeah.
And get okay.
Yeah. And they will still remain in focus in the center, especially when you zoom out to the mid, because it'll again expand that focus range.
That's cool.
So you gotta. This is very easy to kind of mess up. So you want to watch out for these.